I heard the splash first, the unmistakable plop of something heavy hitting the water. I grabbed my fishing pole and ran barefoot down the slope behind my A-frame cabin. The early sun lit up Willowbend Cove like a postcard. I expected to see a fish jumping or maybe a raccoon falling in again. What I found instead made my stomach twist. A wrought iron gate. Brand new. Gleaming. Tall. Black. Mocking me like a monument to some cruel prank. Behind it, mounted to one of the posts, a polished silver plaque read, "Private SBHC access only. Trespassers will be prosecuted." My dock. My lake. My slice of heaven, now cut off by a barrier I didn't build. And to top it off, a small blinking security camera mounted above the sign. Red light flashing like a robotic middle finger. That's when I knew something absurd and sinister was going on. It didn't take long to learn the name behind the madness. Denise Carver, president of the Silver Pines Homeowners Committee, which I wasn't even part of. I'd bought this land fair and square, years before the subdivision crept in like ivy. Retired after 27 years designing highway overpasses and watershed systems, I'd cashed out, chosen peace, and settled into life at 62, finally ready to fish, read, and forget about clipboards. But that morning, instead of casting my line into the mist, I stood slack-jawed at the sight of black steel bars slicing through the view like dystopian train tracks. The fence extended outward in both directions, eventually curving back toward the private road leading to the rest of the community. Who in their right mind builds a fence around someone else's lake access without even knocking on the door? I got my answer just a few hours later when I heard the click of ambitious sandals on gravel. Striding toward me was Denise Carver, 54, lavender blouse pressed to perfection, clipboard cradled in her arms like a holy relic. Her smile was the kind that says, "This is happening whether you like it or not." "Hello there," she chirped. "We've installed a protective barrier around the lakeside access strip. Strictly for Silver Pines residents, of course, liability concerns." I blinked. "I live right there," I said, pointing to my cabin. "This is my dock. My access to the lake." Denise cocked her head like a confused schoolteacher correcting a child. "Well, technically, the access strip rests on a parcel now maintained by the SBHC. You must have missed the notices. We sent several." She tapped her clipboard for effect. My blood pressure spiked so hard I could hear it in my ears. "I didn't get a single notice. And how did you get permission to build this? That land isn't part of your HOA." "Oh, but it is now," she said sweetly. "We acquired the lease last fall from the bait shop owner. Poor man passed away, and the parcel reverted to open bid. We secured it and redesignated it as community property." It took me a second to realize what she'd done. That narrow strip between my deeded land and the lake had once held a rickety shack full of worms and warm soda. I'd assumed it was part of my county easement. Turns out, it wasn't. And Denise had swooped in like a hawk, leased it quietly, and fenced me out of my own peace. "Let me guess," I said through clenched teeth. "You didn't tell a soul who actually lives nearby." "It was discussed in our October meeting," she replied, fully above board. "You're welcome to submit a formal appeal, though, as a non-member, I'm afraid you won't have voting rights." I stood there stunned. I wasn't part of the SBHC. I never wanted to be. I'd bought this land before their bylaws were even typed up. Yet somehow, this lavender-wearing HOA overlord had boxed me out like a trespasser in my own yard. The next morning, I brought bolt cutters. Not to make trouble, at first, but to reclaim what was mine. The padlock was thick, industrial, and I'd barely snipped one link before a uniformed security guard rolled up, followed by Denise herself, already dialing the sheriff. To his credit, the deputy seemed confused too. He studied the property lines, then gave me the bad news. I own the cabin, the backyard, even the slope that led down to the water, but not the 6-foot-wide parcel with the dock and the fence. That, technically, was under SBHC lease. I couldn't believe it. Denise watched the entire exchange like she was at a matinee opera, sipping tea behind invisible curtains. That day, the sign changed. A second one went up. "No trespassing. $10,000 fine. Camera monitored." And just like that, I'd gone from retired engineer to prisoner in my own fishing dream. I brought my bolt cutters like some renegade freedom fighter, ready to snip through tyranny one steel link at a time. The early morning fog still hovered low over Willowbend Cove, and I moved like a man with nothing left to lose. I barely got through the first bar before I heard the dreaded crunch of gravel under heels. Denise Carver, president of the Silver Pines Homeowners Committee, had arrived, clipboard clutched like a weapon and a rent-a-cop security guard following behind her like a confused duckling. She didn't even speak, just pointed. The guard called the sheriff. To his credit, the deputy who showed up looked as baffled as I felt. He checked his maps, flipped through the county parcel records, then exhaled sharply. "Well, Mr. Nolan," he said, "you own the cabin, the slope, the trees, even that garden with the sunflowers. But this tiny strip right here, the one with the dock and the gate, technically leased to the Silver Pines HOA." I stood there stunned, bolt cutters hanging limp in my hand like a dropped sword. Denise looked on from the shade, arms crossed, sunglasses hiding any hint of expression, but I swear I could feel her smirking. By the end of that same week, a new sign went up on the gate. "Do not trespass, $10,000 fine." And of course, the blinking red light of that ridiculous camera now stared into my soul every morning. Like some robot overlord, it never stopped watching. I tried attending one of the SBHC meetings to plead my case, but walking into that room felt like stepping into a bad soap opera. Everyone either feared Denise or was completely entranced by her vision of clipboard-fueled dominance. One guy even told me, "Sorry, you're not on the lake list anymore." I nearly laughed in his face. What the hell was a lake list? And then came the worst part. Denise held the only key to the lock. She held all the power over something that used to be mine. For a few days, I sulked. What could I do? Hire a lawyer and bleed thousands trying to reclaim a 6-foot-wide patch of dirt with a fence on it? Dig a tunnel like some cartoon prisoner? I even considered building a floating dock and launching a kayak invasion just to make a point. Then, one morning, while sipping bitter coffee and stewing in silent rage, I noticed a small white sign tacked to a wooden post near the edge of the fence, "For sale." I froze. It was the parcel right next to the gated strip, the very land Denise thought she had dominion over. I called the number. The agent practically begged me to make an offer. The seller? An elderly woman living in Alaska who'd inherited the land from her late husband and forgotten it even existed. It was split by some legal oddity into 2 narrow lots, and Denise had only leased one of them. The other, the one with the actual gateposts buried in the soil, was still up for grabs. 2 weeks later, the paperwork was finalized. The deed was in my name. I paid less than the price of a used pickup. And just like that, I owned the land Denise had built her precious monument on. She'd locked me out, but now I owned the very lock. I waited a week. Let the fence become official in their minds. Let her get comfortable. The SBHC was planning their annual summer brunch by the lake, an event scheduled right on the other side of my former dock, now claimed as their exclusive community retreat. I watched the preparations from my deck like a hawk with popcorn. Folding chairs appeared. A white tent went up. Someone even wheeled out a chocolate fountain, which felt especially offensive. The morning of the event, I made my move. I walked down to the gate, slow and calm, wearing a sun hat and carrying my lockpick kit, not to break in, but to change the lock. I brought a new heavy-duty padlock, the kind they use on military-grade storage crates. Click. It snapped shut like a judge's gavel. Then, I added a fresh sign. Private property, access by owner permission only. That afternoon, HOA members arrived in pastel polos and floppy hats. Denise came striding toward the gate like she was about to unveil a statue in her own honor. Clipboard in hand, grin tight enough to cut glass. She reached for her key. It didn't fit. She tried again. Still didn't fit. She jiggled, twisted, yanked. Her face turned redder with each failed attempt. Eventually, she turned to the gathering crowd with the fakest smile I've ever seen. "There appears to be a small technical issue with the lock," she announced, voice straining. "But it'll be resolved momentarily." I took a long sip of lemonade and waited for the moment she looked up. When she did, I waved. Then, without saying a word, I tossed her a folded copy of the deed. Denise Carver caught it midair like it was radioactive. She unfolded the pages, scanning the legal jargon like it was written in ancient Greek. Her lips moved silently, like she was trying to summon a spell that might undo what she was reading. Finally, she stammered. This must be a mistake. You can't just buy community property." I walked up to the gate, leaned casually against the fence like it was the railing of my front porch, and said, "You're right. That's why I didn't. I bought my property. The one your fancy gate is standing on, including that lovely stretch of shoreline right up to the big boulder over there." Her face twisted like she'd bitten into a lemon rind. She looked back down at the documents, then at the plot map I'd conveniently highlighted in neon yellow. The dawning horror was delicious, slow, inevitable. She was standing on land the Silver Pines Homeowners Committee didn't own. Not legally, not even close. "But we installed this gate," she blurted, her voice climbing. "Sure," I said, keeping my tone light. "The committee paid for it, but I own the dirt under it, which means it's mine. Technically, I could replace it with a hammock." That got a few chuckles from the crowd gathering behind her. Denise whipped around, eyes wide, scanning the board members for backup. But the tide had shifted. A few looked genuinely uncomfortable, others downright entertained. Lena Park, the sharp-witted SBHC board secretary, raised an eyebrow and folded her arms. Her expression said it all. Denise just walked into her own trap. Without another word, Denise stormed off, cell phone already glued to her ear, barking something about an emergency board meeting. I let her go. There was no meeting that could save her now. The truth was simple. The HOA had leased half the parcel and unknowingly built improvements on land they didn't own. I had purchased the other half, the more crucial half, the one with the gateposts, shoreline, and legal standing. The next day, I filed an official notice with the county clerk's office. From that point forward, the fence was recognized as partially installed on private property, and any tampering or unauthorized modification would be legally considered trespassing. Just to hammer the point home, I sent copies to the SBHC board, the sheriff's department, and, for fun, Denise's lawyer, whose email I found in a public filing. Then I installed a motion-activated camera and a solar-powered floodlight. The spotlight would flare on dramatically every time someone approached the gate from the HOA side. I didn't need it to record. I wasn't building a case. I just wanted them to know I was watching. Denise responded in the only way she knew how, with escalating pettiness. First came a letter accusing me of sabotaging community morale. Then a formal notice from the SBHC attorney citing some vague clause about cooperative land use. My response: a copy of my deed and a bright yellow post-it that read, "Cooperate this." A few days later, Lena Park stopped by. She wasn't hostile, just curious. She asked if she could walk the property line with me, and I agreed. As we walked along the fence, she shook her head. "She never ran this through the right channels," Lena muttered. "Told the board it was uncontested HOA property. Nobody even looked at the parcel map. She's going to blow a gasket," I said, "when she finds out she spent HOA funds fencing land she doesn't control." Lena smirked. "Then she'd better reinforce that gasket." Over the next few days, everything shifted. The board's tone changed. Tensions flared during SBHC meetings. Whispers of misused funds, bad decisions, and personal power plays began circulating. One board member resigned. Another formally requested a full financial audit. Then Denise made one last Hail Mary. She filed a complaint with the county zoning office, trying to get the land reclassified. That backfired spectacularly. The zoning official came out in person. He reviewed the coordinates and parcel data. Then, in front of several residents, looked Denise in the eye and said, "He owns it. And it's not within SBHC jurisdiction." End of story. End of story? Not quite. Because just days later, Denise returned with a locksmith in tow, hoping to change the gate lock again. The guy checked the paperwork, checked the boundary markers, then called me. I showed up with a receipt, a copy of my deed, and a bag of oatmeal cookies. The locksmith took one, laughed, and drove away without touching the lock. That gate didn't just stay closed. It stayed mine. The locksmith checked the property markers, scratched his head, and called me. I strolled down from the cabin with a bag of oatmeal cookies and a laminated receipt, showing I was the rightful owner of the land. He took one look, chuckled, accepted a cookie, and left without touching a single bolt. He even gave me a thumbs up before backing out of the driveway. That night, I placed a weathered old fishing chair just behind the gate. I sat there with a cooler, a book, and a breeze cutting through the pines, watching the light from Willowbend Cove flicker across the water. The whole scene felt peaceful, almost absurdly so, considering the war being waged on the other side of the fence. Neighbors passed by from time to time. Some looked embarrassed, a few waved. One guy even dropped off a six-pack of IPA and said, "Thanks for standing up to the nonsense." It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about principle. If Denise Carver wanted control, she could look elsewhere. Because on this side of the gate, I was the one with the key. By the time July rolled around, battle lines had been drawn, not with chalk or fences, but with whispers, awkward stares, and passive-aggressive newsletters. The gate had become more than a barrier. It was a symbol. For me, it meant boundaries, ownership, and the sweet, hard-earned taste of poetic justice. For Denise, it was a humiliating monument to her overreach, a visual reminder that her grasp had exceeded her reach. But if I'd learned anything about Denise Carver, it was that defeat wouldn't come with a dramatic exit. She wasn't done. Not even close. Her next move came silently, almost too quietly. It started with boats. Not mine, of course. I couldn't even get my canoe into the water without hoisting it over the fence like I was training for the Highland Games. No, these were HOA boats, paddle boats, kayaks, and tiny skiffs gliding in from the far side of the cove. At first, I figured it was just kids out for a summer float. But soon, I began seeing the same people docking at the back edge of my property, stepping onto land like it was some public park. I confronted a couple with a picnic basket one afternoon. They looked genuinely puzzled. "Oh, we were told this was part of the community lakefront," the man said. "Denise sent out a newsletter about new boat landing zones." I nodded slowly. "Did she also mention who owns this exact piece of land you're standing on?" His wife blinked. "Wait, you own this?" I pointed at the metal sign bolted to the fence. "Private property, parcel number 2483, trespassing not permitted." I'd added that part after the third boat showed up. But things only escalated from there. A week later, a series of bright orange buoys appeared in the water, strung together with netting like a floating fence. They cordoned off the shoreline near my dock. A sign bobbing in the middle read, "Community swim area, SBHC members only." That's when I knew we had officially entered the maritime phase of Denise's campaign. I called the county again. They sent out a field inspector to review property lines and navigable water zones. The verdict came fast and final. The HOA had no legal authority over Willowbend Cove's public waters. The buoys were unauthorized and had to go. They vanished within the week. I didn't even have to lift a finger. But if you thought that was the end, you've never dealt with Denise Carver. The following week, a local teen, Tyler Quinn, slipped me a folder like he was passing off state secrets. Inside were scans of the most recent SBHC meeting minutes, which his mom had accidentally printed and left out on the kitchen counter. Gold. Lena Park had objected multiple times to Denise's decisions, and Denise had bulldozed right over her, as usual. What stood out was the language being used. Mentions of potential litigation, a reclamation strategy, and a proposal to vote the disputed parcel into community greenway designation. In other words, she was planning to vote her way back into control of land I owned outright. That's when I stopped playing defense. I called up my old college buddy Brian, now working with the county's Municipal Zoning and Preservation Board. After a coffee and a deep dive into the ancient records, we found something beautiful. The strip of land I'd purchased was under 6 feet wide in several sections. It didn't qualify as essential infrastructure, and that meant, under Colorado's non-commercial environmental preservation clause, I could apply to reclassify it as protected ecological habitat. And that, dear reader, was when the game changed. I applied to have the parcel reclassified as a restricted access ecological habitat, and with help from my buddy Brian at the municipal zoning office, we drafted the paperwork. 2 weeks later, it was done. My narrow strip of shoreline, once just a forgotten slice of dirt between property lines, was now legally protected. No development, no events, no bonfires, folding chairs, or lemonade stands without a formal permit. The dock, the gate, the path, all designated an environmental rest corridor. The county even installed a green and white sign to make it official. It looked like something out of a state park, and I loved every inch of it. The reaction from the Silver Pines Homeowners Committee was instant and hilarious. Panic swept through the board like a dropped casserole at a potluck. Denise Carver called an emergency meeting to address the misuse of environmental loopholes. Her words, not mine. But this time, her charm had run dry. The residents were exhausted. The board was split. And the next day, Lena Park showed up at my door, trying not to laugh. "She tried to stage a vote to override your classification," she said, handing me a cookie. claimed it was bad faith. I read the county ordinance aloud, told everyone you followed every rule, and even paid the filing fee yourself. The motion didn't even get a second. The cookie was oatmeal raisin, but I forgave her. Tension bubbled across the neighborhood like a teapot left too long on the stove. Denise wouldn't let go. Every morning, she paced the property line, phone in hand, snapping photos like a wannabe detective trying to solve a crime no one committed. Then, one warm afternoon, I caught her red-handed. I was out watering my tomato plants when I noticed movement near the gate. There she was, crouched like a raccoon in heels, screwdriver in hand, trying to loosen the hinge bolts. I didn't say a word, just walked up behind her until my shadow fell across her back. She froze. Looking for something? I asked casually. Denise turned, still crouched, halfway through the motion of removing a bolt. Oh, I was just inspecting. A resident said the gate looked unstable. Funny, I said. Camera footage shows no one's touched it, except you. Her eyes widened. You installed a camera? Perfectly legal, I said. Also has a decent microphone. She stood up quickly, brushing off her knees like that would restore her dignity. You're being extremely uncooperative. I pointed to the county sign. And you're lucky I don't charge admission. Now kindly leave before you add trespassing to your resume. She turned on her heel and stomped away, red-faced and muttering. The final blow came the following week. Lena called another board meeting. This time, she came prepared. She had the votes to authorize a full financial audit of the SBHC's spending. Turns out, Denise had personally greenlit over $88,000 for fencing, security enhancements, and even a board stress relief retreat at a luxury spa, booked under her niece's name. The board suspended her pending investigation. 2 days later, she resigned, blaming what she called a toxic governance environment. Word traveled fast. Neighbors I hadn't even met before started stopping by to shake my hand. Someone brought a homemade pie. A kid dropped off a hand-painted sign that read, "Local legend, gatekeeper of Willow Bend." I hung it next to my fishing chair. The lake slowly returned to peace. The buoys never came back. The fence stayed locked, but always open for the kids who wanted to fish or the older couples who liked to sit by the water. I had a neat stack of laminated permission slips for anyone respectful enough to ask. As for the HOA, they started redrafting their charter. Fewer gate metaphors, more actual neighborly common sense. And me? I finally got back to fishing. Just when I thought the story had ended, Denise came back. Not in person, oh no. She returned in the only place left that still welcomed her, the internet. Like some HOA villain rebooted for a streaming sequel no one asked for, Denise launched a full-blown social media crusade. Save our shoreline. She built a Facebook group, uploaded rant-filled YouTube videos, and dropped TikToks filmed in her new backyard, now 3 states away in Arizona. Her editing skills were somewhere between a middle school AV class and a fever dream, complete with shaky green screen graphics and dramatic music. She called me an unhinged non-member squatter, the fence tyrant, and my favorite, the gate goblin. And just like that, the story wasn't over. But I had something she didn't. A gate, a deed, and a lawn chair by the lake. Apparently, Denise Carver had moved to Florida, but distance hadn't dulled her thirst for drama. If anything, it sharpened it. She re-emerged online with the chaotic energy of a conspiracy theorist and the editing skills of a teenager using free Wi-Fi at a gas station. Her videos were something to behold. In one, she stood in front of a poorly cut green screen image of Willow Bend Cove, declaring that an entitled non-member had seized sacred community shoreline and weaponized red tape to build a personal kingdom. She showed blurry screenshots of my gate, complete with aggressive labels like greedy, anti-neighbor, and my personal favorite, the gate goblin. Another video featured dramatic orchestral music, slow pans across stock photos of crying children, and inexplicably confused ducks. Real ducks, quacking in slow motion, apparently representing the silenced voices of the community. Her grand finale? A storm-filtered monologue titled The Bureaucratic Tyrant of Willow Bend, a 10-minute rant about how I used environmental manipulation to enslave an entire lakeside. Theatrics aside, I might have laughed it off if it hadn't gone viral. One of the videos was picked up by a mid-level outrage blogger, and suddenly my quiet little fence was trending. People were sharing clips with hashtags like #LakeLockdown and #FreeTheDock. Strangers left comments on my public land records. One person called my voicemail asking how much I charged to rent the land back to the community. Another offered to fly in from Oregon to film a documentary. I asked if he'd ever been to Colorado. He replied, "No, but injustice is universal." At first, I was furious. I didn't want fame or infamy. I just wanted to fish and not argue with clipboard dictators. But then, something beautiful happened. The internet turned on Denise. Reddit threads lit up dissecting her videos, pointing out inconsistencies, and connecting her to HOA controversies from other neighborhoods. Someone found an old Yelp review she left for a nail salon that read like a political manifesto. Another thread titled, "HOA Queen Tries to Fence a Lake, Gets Wrecked by Fishing Grandpa," hit the front page. And then came the memes. One showed me in my fishing chair, lemonade in hand, with the caption, "You shall not base." Another read, "Gatekeeping done right." A local news station reached out for a feel-good segment. I declined politely, not wanting to fuel the fire, but they ran the story anyway. They even zoomed in dramatically on the county deed, narrated like it was an unsolved crime. Lena Park called me the next day, laughing so hard she could barely speak. "It's official," she gasped. "You're Willowbend's first viral legend." As internet trends do, the hype faded with time, but not without consequences for Denise. The attention triggered a deeper look into her time as head of the Silver Pines Homeowners Committee. A few former residents she'd alienated came forward. Old complaints were reopened: misuse of funds, falsified citations, manipulations of board votes. It wasn't enough for criminal charges, but it was enough to blacklist her from holding HOA leadership roles, not just in Willowbend, but across several statewide community boards. And then came the cherry on top. Turns out Denise had submitted a forged permit for the original gate. She'd claimed the land was HOA controlled when it wasn't. The zoning office caught wind of it after the renewed attention and issued her a fine, nearly $10,000, plus legal fees. Her online presence went quiet not long after. No more green screens. No more ducks. Her last post was a cryptic one, moving on to better waters. I assumed that meant a gated condo in Boca Raton. Back in Willowbend, things finally started to breathe again. The air was lighter, the water clearer. Lena and the new SBHC board began rewriting the bylaws with a focus on transparency and community involvement. She even invited me to join one of their sessions, not as a member, but as a consultant. I declined the formal offer, but I did swing by with donuts and sarcasm. Fair trade. One quiet morning, I walked down to the gate and paused. The heavy-duty padlock I'd installed months ago glinted in the sun like a battle medal. And then, I unlocked it. I left the gate wide open, not as surrender, but as a statement. In its place, I posted a small laminated sign. Access granted by courtesy. Respect earns welcome. Entitlement earns nothing. I didn't need the gate to keep people out anymore. Most folks asked before stepping through now, and that was enough. What began as a fence had become a symbol, not of exclusion, but of boundaries, patience, and standing your ground with dignity. In place of the lock, I installed a small wooden post with a laminated sign that read, "Access granted by courtesy. Respect earns welcome. Entitlement earns nothing." It wasn't a legal restriction anymore. It was a test of character. And the surprising part? People passed. That very week, I got a knock on the door from a teenage boy I hadn't seen before. He introduced himself as Tyler Quinn, said his family had just moved in, and that he'd heard I owned the best fishing spot on Willowbend Cove. "I'm not gonna lie," he said, shifting nervously. "My friends dared me to sneak in, but my grandpa always said the right way slower, but it doesn't burn bridges." I looked at him for a long second, then pulled out one of the laminated permission slips I kept in a folder under my porch swing. "Welcome to the lake, Tyler," I said. "Just clean up your bait wrappers, and don't scare the fish." His grin could have lit up the whole shoreline. The next few weeks were the most peaceful I'd felt since moving in. Kids came by to fish. Retirees strolled the shoreline again. Even the raccoons seemed less aggressive. The gate stood open, weathered and a little off-kilter from all the drama, but still standing. Less a wall, more a monument. And here's the twist. People started treating the place better than ever. Maybe it was the story. Maybe it was the quiet symbolism. Or maybe they just didn't want to end up in one of my revenge tales. Not long after, I received a letter in the mail from Denise Carver. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't quite an apology either. It was oddly formal. She wrote that she'd reevaluated her relationship with leadership roles and was now working with advocacy groups in her new state to combat HOA abuse. She included a pamphlet from one such group and a handwritten note that read, "We might have started as enemies, but maybe we both taught each other something." I didn't respond. I figured letting it end there was more powerful than anything I could write. Besides, I had fish to catch. And so, the gate remained, rusted, sturdy, and open. Not because I had to leave it that way, but because I could. The irony wasn't lost on me. A fence that had once shut me out had become a symbol of who could come in. The key wasn't metal. It was manners. 1 year later, to the day, I stood on the same dock, thermos in one hand, fishing pole in the other, staring out at the same patch of lake that had once been the epicenter of the most ridiculous property dispute in county history. The gate still stood. The paint had faded. The frame leaned slightly from age and weather, but I'd left it untouched, not to gloat, not even as a warning, but because it had become part of the story. And sometimes, stories matter more than structures. That summer, Lena Park organized Lake Appreciation Day, a low-key event to celebrate the volunteers who cleaned up the shoreline, revised the SBHC charter, and restored a bit of humanity to our corner of Colorado. I hadn't planned to go. I was fine staying in the background, where I belonged. But then I heard my name called over a megaphone. I looked up and saw a small crowd gathered on the shore, clapping. Kids held up hand-painted signs that read things like, "Thanks, gate guy. We read Heart the Dock." One had drawn a cartoon version of me with a fishing hat and a laser beam shooting out of the gate. Still not sure why the laser, but it was excellent artwork. I tried to wave them off, but Lena marched over and dragged me up to the front. She handed me a plaque, real wood, carved beautifully. It read, "In recognition of community integrity and unmatched patience." I half expected it to say most likely to cause petty chaos, but it was actually kind. A kid asked me if I was going to write a book about everything. I told him if I did, it'd be called Denise and the Fence That Couldn't. As I stood there, surrounded by laughter, barbecue smoke, and the hum of neighbors just being neighbors again, I realized something had shifted. Not just on the property lines, but in the people. We shared tools now. Gossip. Leftover cookies. There hadn't been a single HOA fine in 6 months. Later that afternoon, Tyler showed up again, taller this time, and brought his younger sister to fish. I gave her a mini rod I had lying around and showed her how to bait a hook without flinching. She caught a bluegill in under 10 minutes and screamed like she'd landed a shark. Tyler gave me a thumbs up from across the dock. And just like that, things were right again. The gate stood open. The lake shimmered. And the story that began with a lock ended with something better. A lesson in patience, principle, and the quiet kind of power that never needs a key. Surrounded by laughing neighbors and the smell of barbecue drifting across the lawn, I realized something strange had happened. Somewhere between the property disputes, internet fame, and HOA meltdowns, Willowbend Cove had become something better. A community. People were talking to each other again. We shared tools, passed along cookie recipes, and swapped gossip about which raccoon kept raiding the trash cans. The new board under Lena Park was transparent. The rules made sense. And for the first time in over a year, there hadn't been a single gate-related incident. That was practically a miracle. Later that afternoon, Tyler Quinn showed up again. He'd grown maybe an inch since I'd first met him, but the same eager grin was there. This time, he brought his younger sister to fish with him. I handed her a mini rod I had lying around and taught her how to bait a hook without flinching. 10 minutes later, she caught her first bluegill and screamed like she'd reeled in a prehistoric beast. Tyler flashed me a thumbs up from across the dock, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it should be. Peaceful, simple, alive. Then came the twist. Right around sunset, a silver sedan crept up to the edge of the road. The car door opened slowly, and a woman stepped out, her sunglasses catching the last of the orange light. She wore a floral scarf, a stiff blouse, and flats far too clean for a place with gravel trails and muddy shoreline. She walked slowly, deliberately. People noticed. Voices went quiet. Someone whispered, "Is that?" I didn't have to hear the name. I already knew. Denise Carver. She stood by the gate like someone visiting the ghost of a bad decision. To her credit, she didn't speak, didn't make a scene. She simply stared at the water for a long moment, then reached into her purse and pulled out a small wooden box. She opened it, looked inside, then closed it again without taking anything out. I didn't move, didn't speak. A part of me expected fireworks, one last outburst, a camera, a speech. But instead, she turned, looked directly at me across the lake's golden shimmer, and said, not loudly, "Still got the key?" I raised my thermos slightly. "Still don't need to use it." She gave me the faintest nod. No dramatics. No swan song. Just a quiet exit, stage left. Conversations resumed. Laughter returned like a breeze brushing away a tense fog. Lena came over and asked, "You okay?" I shrugged. People change. Or they don't. Either way, I'm not the one who needs to figure that out. My job was simple. Keep the kids from hooking each other, keep the chairs from sinking into the mud, and make sure nobody flipped the bait bucket. That night, as the sun dipped behind the pine line and the lake shimmered like fire-kissed glass, a few of us stayed behind. We roasted marshmallows over a little fire pit. Tyler used sticks and fire pokers to act out the Great Gate War, complete with voices and dramatic reenactments. A retired couple brought me homemade apple pie and said, "Thanks for keeping the board honest." I didn't do much, I replied. They disagreed. Eventually, the group drifted home. I stayed, sitting in my weathered fishing chair, listening to the water whisper its familiar lullaby. I looked at the open gate, the signpost, and the trail worn by hundreds of respectful feet. A year ago, I had been locked out. Now people walk through freely, but on my terms. Just one rule, don't be a jerk. I thought about the angry emails, the rogue locksmith, the zoning paperwork that read like a legal thesis. I thought about memes, YouTube clips, and that one Reddit thread titled "Gatekeeper Grandpa Wins, HOA Civil War." I reached down into my tackle box and pulled out the original padlock, Denise's padlock, still rusted, frozen shut from rain and time. I placed it on the gate post and left it there. A silent trophy, a relic from a time when lines were drawn in steel instead of kindness. As I turned to head back toward the house, porch light warm and waiting, I heard footsteps. Tyler again, breathless. "You coming to the late-night fish-off tomorrow?" he asked. "Wouldn't miss it." "Cool," he said, then paused. "Also, someone stapled your fishing hat to the SBHC bulletin board. Said it's community art now." I raised an eyebrow. "Was it you?" "Maybe," he grinned. "Legacy piece." I chuckled. "Remind me to charge you rent next time." As I stepped inside, the sounds of laughter echoed faintly across the lake. The water stayed calm. The gate stood open, and the story that began with a lock ended with something better. A legacy, not just of property rights, but of standing tall, staying kind, and knowing that sometimes the best key is the one you give away.